Hello everyone, welcome back. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to the second episode of Hominem against Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So as you can see, I'm on a train right now and I'm going to the land of the Islamophobe to debunk some more of their ridiculous claims. I've got genuinely good response from my previous video. And so far I'm actually very happy with it because the arguments I've made, I haven't seen a single refutation, logical refutations to any of my arguments. So I'm quite happy about that. I've seen a lot of trolls, they kind of rant and they just kind of go away, or I usually delete their comments. Especially if it's like off topic. And by the way, this is a warning. If you're gonna troll, I'm gonna delete your comments, so don't bother. If you have something important to say regarding the topic, then you're allowed to say it, but be respectful. And so yeah, with that being said, let's get into it. So yeah, enjoy. Number 3, we don't worship the prophet. So Islamophobes have this misconception that if they attack the character of the prophet, that will somehow destroy Islam or whatever. The problem is that even if you do that, it won't harm Islam in any way, shape or form, because we don't worship the prophet, unlike our Christian friends. The prophet was only a human being with an important message for mankind. He was definitely one of the best that humanity has to offer, but we don't worship him, so attacking him is pointless. And it does nothing against Islam except hurt the feelings of the Muslims. The prophet was not infallible. Now, the prophet himself admitted that he wasn't perfect in regards to matters of the world. And in regards to things like politics, agriculture, medicine, etc. He was like all other people. Allah did not tell us that he was sent to us as a businessman or a farmer or a carpenter or doctor, etc. His mistakes in this field are quite natural, and they are human mistakes, and they do not impact Islam at all. The message of Islam is independent of the character of the prophet, or even if you want to consider it, his mistake. For example, our prophet made many mistakes actually, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala oftentimes would point it out and would correct him, which is quite interesting. And this is actually one of the proofs that he was actually a prophet of God and not some phony, because why else would he correct himself? It doesn't make any sense. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. For example, I will give an example of a hadith. It was reported by Rafi ibn Khudaya, who said, the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him, came to Medina, and they were pollinating, and some people were pollinating the date palms, and he saw that, and he said that, what are you doing? They said, we always do this kind of pollinating. This usually gives us better fruit. And he said that maybe if you don't do that, that would be better. And they listened to him. So they didn't pollinate the way that they were doing before. Now the problem is, after that the harvest was lacking, and they didn't get enough fruit. So they mentioned it to the Prophet, and the Prophet said, look, it was my personal opinion, and I'm only a human being just like you. If I tell you to do something with regard to religion, then follow it. But if I tell you to do something based on my own opinion, I am only a human being. Now remember, this is coming from the same person who split the moon in half in front of the whole Medina. If his real goal was to if he was like some kind of fake prophet, don't you think he would say things like, kind of like make something up? Why would he admit that he's wrong? That doesn't make any sense. So now, as we can see, the Prophet himself admitted that he wasn't perfect. And this is what we Sunni Muslims believe, by the way. This is also the opinion of the scholars as well. So this is not me saying this. This is actually according to the scholars. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, the belief that the Prophet is perfect or infallible actually comes from the Shia or the Rafidi. So again, if they come to the Sunni Muslim with this type of accusation that the Prophet was a bad person, he did this or that, XYZ, etc., chances are they will be doing nothing but wasting their time and hurting the feelings of the Muslims, because this will not prove Islam is false or that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was a false prophet. This is actually a proof that the Prophet was a true prophet, because this shows his honesty. If he was some kind of fraud or hungry for power, why would he ever admit that he was wrong? He would make up some story, He admitted that he was wrong. And he could easily make up a story about it, which he didn't. And it proves that he was an honest person and true prophet. Number 5, different timeline and faulty comparison fallacy. Now, another problem with one of their very popular accusations is the faulty comparison fallacy. So oftentimes what they'll do is that they'll take the modern moral values, their modern or liberal, Western, secular 21st century values, and they'll take what is considered normal in the 21st century and then apply that to the 6th century Arabia, which is ridiculous. And this is a fallacy, because this is the faulty comparison fallacy, because you're trying to compare two things that has nothing to do with each other. The morality that you have in 21st centuries will not match up with what they had in the 6th century, because they lived in completely different timelines. The contexts are completely different. The situations are completely different. Back then, people used to fight each other just because of some argument. They used to go to war because of some stupid argument. I remember that I was reading once that there was apparently a 70-year war based on some gambling debt. Because some guy lost, and this happened in the medieval time. Some guy lost some money, and somehow that ended up into a full-blown war between two tribes. And that's crazy, but that's how life was back then. If you watch any historical documentary, or even TV shows like Game of Thrones or something like that, or any kind of historical show like Vikings, you will see that back then life was not like how it was now. Back then you either got conquered or you were the one who were doing the conquering. So you cannot take your moral values from the 21st century, which is an end product of all that violence. After all that violence, we were finally able to get this value, or you were able to get this value that you have now. And you're going to take that luxury and judge the people who gave those values to you? Seriously? These people made way for this value, for you to have these values in the first place. So judging them based on your moral values now is it's ridiculous, and it's an intellectual dishonesty. And again, like I said, this is a faulty comparison fallacy, because you cannot take things like feminism or or things like slavery, which was completely normal back then, and then judge them. Feminism didn't exist back then in 6th century Arabia. The closest thing they had to feminism was burying their daughter alive. And that's literally their practice. It was the Prophet who said that, no, you can't do that. So it's kind of ridiculous to take this kind of new modern values, which is like completely new, and apply that to the 6th century. It makes no sense. So yeah, this is why this is not acceptable, these kind of arguments, and they're actually kind of stupid. So again, these are historical figures, and Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he lived in the 6th century Arabia. If you're going to judge him, you have to judge him based on the values of 6th century Arabian tribe. You cannot judge him by secular modern 21st century values. That's just not fair, and also it's intellectually dishonest. Example. Now I'm gonna use Apostateprophet's video about Aisha as an example.
3. It was normal back then to marry young girls. Why don't we focus on now?
Well, so basically in his video, he kind of brushed it over. Was that it was completely normal back then, so it was okay when they got married. But he didn't go into detail, because if he got into detail, his whole video would be completely destroyed, because that one point is enough to destroy this whole argument about the Prophet's marriage with Aisha radiallahu anha. And basically I've seen an article. In that article it says that archaeologists have found a bone remain of a Roman worker, and they've done some studies, and they've come to the conclusion that back then the ancient Romans, or in medieval times Romans, Roman workers specifically, they had a lifespan of 30 years. Now when I saw that I kind of wasn't shocked, but like then I read the whole thing and it started making sense. And then when you hear something like that, our ancestors, or these people who lived in the medieval times, and their lifespan was literally only 30 years. I mean, can you imagine? That's crazy. So the question comes to mind is that why wouldn't these people marry children or get married when they're children or kids? I mean, it makes perfect sense. They only had 30 years to live, and that's how life was back then. People got married early because they died early, and life was extremely hostile back then. People died from childbirth, they died from famine, war, plagues. People just generally didn't live long. And while there are exceptions to this case, and some people did live long, but they're rare, and mostly people lived about 30 to 40 years old. So when you think about it, a 9-year-old girl would technically be close to 20 or 30 or something in today's age, and a 18-year-old girl who would probably be an old woman back then. So it's kind of crazy to think about, but when you see actual evidence of this, your whole perspective shifts. So, and this whole thing about Prophet's marriage with Aisha, it becomes more focused, because you have a situation where he lived in 6th century Arabia, and back then in Rome, girls or boys, I don't know, I think guys got married a bit older, but girls usually got married around 40, which, if you ask me, is actually a little old, because I feel like they should get married a little younger, because if they really did live for only about 30 years, then 50 is almost close to 40. Today's 40. So they actually got married pretty old, but that isn't always the case. In some cases, the girls even got married when they're 10 or 9, because 10 or 9 back then would probably be today's 20 or 30. So it's not unusual it's actually quite normal. As a matter of fact, if they didn't marry early, or if they didn't get married 10 to 12 years old, the whole population would go extinct, because if they're married according to the Islamophobe logics, they would have to get married at 18, and they'll be too old, and they'll probably be too old to have children. So it doesn't make any sense for them to marry that old, because they only have 30-40 years to live. Why would they wait that long? And also, it's not like they had schools back then. Back then they didn't have internet or schools or high school or college, none of that. Back then, instead of watching PewDiePie videos, 9-year-olds got busy making babies. That's literally how it was. And by the way, it's interesting because when you read some of the earlier writers' work, this comes more into focus because, for example, in Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet, Juliet is what, like 12 or 14 years old, and at first I didn't think about it, but when you start thinking about it, it starts to make sense. I mean, because they lived in medieval times. That's when, back then, 30 or 40 years old were considered adult women, so they weren't considered teenagers, they were just considered women, because back then they didn't have the luxury of being a teenager. They went from childhood to almost adulthood. They got married. And this is also repeated in another writer's work. He's very popular, George R. R. Martin, and I don't know if you guys read his book, Song of Ice and Fire. In that book, most of the characters are like 12 to 13 years old, or some even 10 or 9. And one of the characters, Robb Stark, he's kind of become the king. He's 15 years old or something. And there's a scene in Game of Thrones, the TV show that's based on a book, where Cersei Lannister asks Sansa that has she bled yet.
You're tall. Still growing.
I think so, Your Grace.
And have you bled yet?
No, Your Grace.
And she's about 12 or 13 years old or something like that, because she knows that if she has bled, that means that she's a woman now. Because back then that's how they determined whether they were old or not to get married. And that's kind of smart, because George R. R. Martin, he's a very good writer, and he probably did his study about medieval history, so he can probably tell back then this was the norm. So yeah, and I'm gonna share the link with you guys about the research paper and the finding that they found about the ancient Romans, who ancient Roman workers who lived only about 30 years old, and that pretty much says it all. Back then people didn't live long, so they get married early. And Aisha, as far as I know, she also was proposed by another man before, and her father was considering the marriage. But by the way, the marriage with Aisha wasn't the prophet's idea. It was actually suggested to him by one of his followers called Khawla bint Hakim. She was one of his companions, and it was her idea, and that he be married to Aisha. And the thing is that she was also a woman, which means that this is something that was considered as completely normal in the society. Also, that's not all. She was actually supposed to marry another man called Zubair ibn Mutim before she was married to the Prophet. Aisha radiallahu was supposed to marry this man before the Prophet, and which again shows that this is something that was considered normal among the 6th century Arab tribes, or the Arab society. This is mentioned by Ibn Kathir in the life of Prophet Muhammad in his Al-Sira al-Nabiyya, and this was translated by Trevor Lee Gassick. This is you can find this in volume 2, page number 94 to 95. Also, according to Professor Leila Ahmed of Harvard Divinity School, who is a well-known writer and historian and scholar, in her book Woman and Gender in Islam, she writes that Aisha's marriage to Prophet Muhammad was presented as something ordinary in Islamic literature, and may indicate that it was completely normal for younger girls to be married to their elders in that area, or in that era. So as you can see, the Prophet's marriage to Aisha was completely normal in the society because no one objected to it. Also, like, it was suggested to the prophet by someone else, which means that this was something that was considered completely normal for 8 or 6 or 9-year-old girls to be married to to their elders. I mean, this wasn't something that was considered abnormal or even unusual. And the funny thing is that this whole complaint only came very later. Like, this is not something that the Christians complain about in the 6th century or even the prophet's enemies, they never complained about this because this was considered completely normal. It's only in later times that this became an issue. So yeah, but again, when you think about it, this whole argument falls apart, about when Islamophobes make this claim that prophet was, the P word, and which he wasn't, because only Aisha is the only one who was young. His other wives were quite older. So yeah, I think that pretty much debunks it. But and this is basically what I'm talking about, different timelines. I mean, you can't judge a 6th century Arab custom or medieval times with modern times. It's faulty comparison. It doesn't make sense. And with that, I'm gonna end the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know a lot of new subscribers have joined us. Thank you for the view and the subscription. It means a lot. So yeah, so I'm not gonna go into details. However, I will share with you guys an awesome research paper that was done by Yakin Institute. It's written by Brother Asadullah Ali Andalusi and Dr. Jonathan Brown. So it's literally like Superman and Batman teaming up. Muslim intellectual Superman and Batman teaming up together. So yeah, definitely check it out. And this research paper completely destroys this whole accusation against our prophet about him marrying a 9-year-old. And this research paper basically destroyed all of that argument and basically shatters it into pieces, especially Apostate Prophet's video. So definitely check it out. I'm gonna post it in the links below. And with that, I'm gonna end the video. Thank you for watching. Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And see you on the next one. Bye.